1. The rise of Moscow and its influence on Ukraine, 15th century. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, after the fall of Kievan Rus and its destruction by the Mongols, Moscow began to establish itself as the new center of power in Eastern Europe. Although the Mongols had destroyed Kievan Rus, their rule over Russian lands was not eternal. Moscow, originally a minor settlement, became a political and cultural center. Under Grand Prince Ivan III, Ivan the Great, who defeated the Mongols in 1480, the Rus began to free themselves from Mongol domination and laid the foundation for the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, Ukraine continued to develop under the influence of Poland in the west. By the 14th century, parts of Ukraine had already become part of the Polish kingdom. However, this political connection was marked by tension as the Ukrainian population increasingly became estranged from Polish rule. The Catholic Church, which Poland recognized as its faith, was another point of conflict, as the majority of Ukrainians adhered to the Orthodox faith. These religious and cultural differences played a significant role in the later course of history. 2. The Cossack uprisings and the formation of the Cossack state, 16th to 17th century. In the 16th and 17th centuries, tensions between the Polish crown and the Ukrainian population led to a series of Cossack uprisings, which eventually resulted in the creation of an independent Cossack state. The Cossacks, a military community living on the vast Ukrainian steppes, fought against Polish authority and sought autonomy. The most notable uprising was the Khmelnytsky Uprising of 1648, led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky. This led to the formation of a Cossack state under the suzerainty of Russia after he formed an alliance with the Tsar of Moscow. The outcome was the Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654, in which Ukraine officially became part of the Russian Empire. Russia secured the military support of the Cossacks in the event of hostilities with Poland, thereby asserting control over Ukraine. However, the Ukraine, once part of Kievan Rus, had now given up its independence and was integrated into the Russian Empire. This treaty and the end of Cossack freedom had long-term consequences for Ukrainian identity. 3. The Russian Empire and Ukraine in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 18th century, the Russian Empire expanded under the rule of Empress Catherine the Great. While Ukraine remained under Russian rule, the Cossacks as a political and military unit were increasingly marginalized. The government in St. Petersburg sought to suppress Ukrainian culture and language by enforcing Russian laws and customs. However, Ukrainian identity survived, largely due to rural traditions and the resistance of the population. Russia further expanded its influence over Ukrainian territories in the 18th century, conquering the Crimean Khanate and beginning the settlement of the steppe regions. Ukraine was now part of the Russian Empire, which stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Despite the political dominance of Russia, Ukrainian cultural and ethnic identity remained alive, even as it was repeatedly threatened by the Russian central government. In the 19th century, national movements began to emerge in Ukraine, directed against Russian rule. This movement, largely supported by intellectuals and artists, led to an intensified cultural identity and a desire for autonomy. At the same time, the Russian government began to promote Ukrainian culture to solidify its control over the region. However, Ukraine remained politically and economically dependent on Russia, leading to increasing dissatisfaction and tension. 4. The Russian Revolution and Ukraine in the 20th century. The 20th century was a turbulent era for both Ukraine and Russia. After the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the overthrow of the Tsarist government, Ukraine became the scene of a bloody civil war between various political factions. While the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, secured power in Russia, Ukraine fought for its independence. In 1918, the Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed, but it was short-lived. The Bolsheviks occupied the land and made it part of the Soviet Union, which was founded in 1922. The 1920s and 1930s were especially grim for Ukraine. Under the rule of Joseph Stalin, the country experienced a devastating famine known as the Holodomor. Millions of Ukrainians died when the Soviet government confiscated grain and food from the region and implemented forced collectivization. The Holodomor is now recognized as genocide in Ukraine. As many historians believe, Stalin deliberately caused the famine to crush the Ukrainian independence movement. In the 1940s, during World War II, Ukraine was occupied by Nazi Germany. The region suffered both under German occupation and Soviet reprisals. Ukraine became a center of resistance against the Nazis, and thousands of Ukrainians fought in the Red Army or in partisan groups against the German occupation. However, even after the war, Ukraine remained under Soviet control, which lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. 5. The collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukraine's independence, 1990. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s marked a dramatic turning point in Ukrainian history. On August 24, 1990, Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union after the government in Moscow, under Mikhail Gorbachev, collapsed. The independence was confirmed by a referendum on December 1, 1991, in which more than 90% of voters supported independence. However, even after independence, relations between Ukraine and Russia remained tense. Russia often considered Ukraine part of its sphere of influence, while Ukraine sought to strengthen its national identity and move closer to the West. This contrast became especially apparent after 2000, when Ukraine attempted to break away from Russia's sphere and sought closer ties with the European Union and NATO. 6. The Orange Revolution and the annexation of Crimea, 2004-2014. A high point of tension between Ukraine and Russia was the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004. When Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-Western politician, won the presidential elections, the Russian government refused to recognize the election results and supported Yushchenko's political opponent, Viktor Yanukovych. The public protests in Kiev led to a repeat of the election, and Yushchenko was finally confirmed as president. But in 2014, a dramatic turning point occurred when Yanukovych was ousted after a series of protests known as the Euromaidan. Ukraine elected a new pro-Western president, Petro Poroshenko. This led to a dramatic conflict with Russia, which saw its geopolitical interests in Ukraine threatened. In March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, a peninsula in the Black Sea that had previously been part of Ukraine. This sparked an international scandal and led to sanctions against Russia. Simultaneously, a violent conflict broke out in eastern Ukraine as pro-Russian separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions fought against the Ukrainian government. The war, which continues to this day, has claimed thousands of lives and further strained relations between the two countries. 7. The war in Ukraine and the geopolitical crisis, 2014-present. The conflict in Ukraine escalated in 2022 when Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. This invasion led to a full-blown war, plunging the country into a devastating conflict and creating massive international tensions. The West, led by the United States and the EU, supported Ukraine with economic sanctions against Russia and military aid for Ukrainian forces. The geopolitical situation is tense, and the conflict has polarized not only Ukraine and Russia, but also the international community. The war has led to a humanitarian crisis and shifted the geopolitical balance in Europe. The outcome of this conflict remains uncertain, but it has forever changed the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Conclusion. The history of Ukraine and Russia, from 1400 to the present, is one of political, cultural, and religious struggles shaped by foreign rule, national identity, and geopolitical ambitions. While Russia developed into a great power, Ukraine repeatedly sought independence and self-determination. Today, both states remain in deep conflict, and their history continues to be defined by geopolitical tensions and the search for national identity.